copied and pasted another thing. Oh well, they shouldn't. Sorry, I'll be getting this.
Welcome to WebEx. Enter your access code or meeting number followed by pound. Your entry 8258669 is not valid, or the meeting is not started yet. Please enter your access code or meeting number followed by pound. Enter your attendee ID number followed by pound. If you do not know your attendee number, press pound to continue.
Well, Sarah, I have
Your line. Your line has been unmuted.
Okay, that's
Okay, because I'm muted.
okay. All right, good afternoon, everyone. If you haven't already, please mute your line. It is *6 to mute because we have about over 70 people on the line, so it'll be helpful if you mute yourself so that everyone can hear me as I go through the webinar. And it will also be helpful if you have your professional standards manual on hand. All right, so this is Professional Standards 101 webinar. I just want to thank you all for taking time out of your busy days helping survivors and sitting in with me to go through the professional standards that were just released on November 8th. So again, if you haven't already, please mute your line. And my name's Courtney Meyer. I'm the Virginia Sexual and Domestic Violence Program Professional Standards Coordinator. And with me is T.R. Smith. She'll be available for technical assistance, so there's her email if you have any issues with WebEx during the webinar. And she'll also be monitoring the chat. So there'll be multiple opportunities for questions throughout, which you can put your questions in through the chat. And here is our agenda for today. I'll be going over the background of the professional standards, the structure of each standard, reviewing each standard and what is expected to meet each standard, the accreditation process, and as I stated already, there'll be plenty of opportunities to ask questions throughout. So just some background, which this is in the beginning of the manual, so I'll go over it very briefly. So the standards were originally housed with the Action Alliance, and then in 2015, the Virginia Sexual and Domestic Violence Program Professional Standards Committee was put into code, and the Professional Standards Committee began meeting in March of 2015. And this is all professional standards. So, any of them out and about, please thank them for their hard work in putting together these standards over the past, 3-4 years that they've been working on it. And also be sure to thank past members, because collectively with past and current members, there's been a lot of work that has been put into the standards. So to wrap up the background, again, my name is Courtney Meyer. I'm the Professional Standards Coordinator, and I was hired in December of 2017. And as you all know, there was a comment period last September. So we thank you all for giving us your feedback on the standards draft at that time. I'm hoping that with the manual that you see in front of you, that you'll see your suggestions and comments implemented, and that changes were made since that time. And then we have the standards release, which just released on November 8th. So going over the structure of the standards, so there's 17 total, and they're broken up into 4 sections. There's the administration, crisis intervention, advocacy, and community engagement. Now, each standard you'll see is in bold, and then underneath each standard are the measures for each standard, and they are in what we in the committee like to call big bold dots as a trauma-informed way of calling those. So the measures are what will determine if you met the standard. So you'll need to meet each measure in order to meet the standard. So going into the administration section, just as a heads up, there will be opportunity for questions after standard number 8 in administration. So standard number 1, this is focusing on ensuring that all of your services are available and accessible to all of the different populations listed there and identities. And the expectations for standard number 1, so with the non-discrimination policy should be inclusive of everything that is listed, all those identities in different populations. There's visible inclusions around your facility, as well as the client paperwork that you utilize should be using inclusive language as well, such as having gender identity options on the paperwork. And that in the training for measure number 4, which talks about training on civil rights, diversity issues, and multicultural competency, that is consistent with what is identified in the training matrix, which is on pages 11 through 13. Then standard number 2 focuses on all your training of your staff and volunteers. So we're expecting that you're documenting the training being done for staff and volunteers, and that you're meeting the initial training requirements that are outlined again in that training matrix, pages 11 through 13. So just to briefly review the first measure under standard 2, that training for initial staff members, volunteers, interns should be completed within the first 3 months. And the committee is going for different training modalities, because the committee understands that it might not be possible for everyone to be coming in person to do the training, all 40 hours of the training. So we give you the opportunity for those different training modalities. And then in the second measure, that is focusing on continuing education. So for staff, that's at least 20 hours of continuing ed, and volunteers are at least 10 hours of continuing ed, and that's annually. A fifth measure, that last measure, it discusses allowing discretion in determining training content requirements and being able to explain why you're making an exception. So an example of this would be, say you have a person that wants to volunteer, and that person has their PhD in trauma, and they have, all that educational background that might be able to exempt them from like certain sections of your training. So they would only need to focus on other aspects that wasn't covered in their educational training. That's kind of one example of like rationale that you could provide for why you're exempting a certain volunteer from parts of your trainings. The standard number 3 then focuses on your sound management, your operational stability, organizational principles, and your accountability and transparency. So expectations for this standard is that the supervisors are receiving the ongoing training and management, supervision, and trauma stewardship responsibilities. That supervisors are meeting regularly with staff. That your agency is demonstrating physical responsibility, so having sound audits and financial policies. That your agency has a plan that protects against the interruption of core services. Your agency has personnel policies, job descriptions, a protocol for staff for responding to a medical emergency, mental health emergency, and emergency that threatens the safety of staff and or individuals being served by the staff. And the final measure for this standard focuses on board of directors, and this is mostly for nonprofit agencies. So it discusses what's required for their orientation training content, which is described more on page 13 in the training matrix. Standard number 4 focuses on policies and practices to ensure a high standard of professional conduct. So this includes complying with employer, employees, state and federal regulation and contracts, having a written policy or plan of a background check for all staff, interns, and volunteers, as well as those who may engage with children to have that Child Protective Services background check. And then finally, having a written ethical behavior policy. Number 5 focuses on complying with VAWA confidentiality with entering your data and protecting against that personally identifying information. So the expectation is that you have a system that complies with the VAWA confidentiality standards to enter that data, that it complies with VAWA confidentiality standards and protects against personally identifying information. I want to quickly show you all a resource on VAWA confidentiality, which I also have available on the professional standards webpage, which I'll show you as well. So this is Technology Safety's website, and it goes over confidentiality for not just VAWA, but also FISPA and VOCA. So this will be really helpful in guiding you in what's expected with the VAWA confidentiality standards. Okay. So then the record retention policy is that last expectation in standard number 5. And standard number 6, still going on with privacy and confidentiality, including the identity of and information provided by the person served during the professional relationship. So expectations with this is having that written operational procedure on record security, maintenance, and access by individuals other than the client, that safeguards are in place against any unauthorized access, fire, loss, or other hazard. The policies, procedures that are in place for how your agency assures compliance with applicable legal requirements, such as the Virginia state law on confidentiality. And then finally, that your agency has an informed, written, and reasonably time-limited client release of information form. Standard 7 focuses on respect and protect the civil and human rights of all those impacted by sexual and domestic violence, such as demonstrating cultural humility, which that definition is in the glossary of the manual on page 15, and ensuring that your agency services are available to everyone, all the identities and populations listed in that second measure of Standard 7. Standard 8 is supporting voluntary services model and respecting survivors' right to self-determination. Expectations that your agency has protocols and practices that support survivors' right to self-determination, and that your agency has a protocol that informs all clients of their rights. So for those of you who don't know me, I am a pug mom of 2. And I thought this was really the only way to ask you all if you had questions. So we will now open it up for questions regarding the administration section. Okay. Yeah, with so there's a question about where the standards are located on the website. I will be showing that near the end. Not only that, but all the resources related to the standards on on the DC Justice website. Are there any other questions regarding the administration section? You can just put those into the chat box. Any questions? Okay, well, if there's no questions so far, we'll keep moving on. We'll move on into the crisis intervention section. The VAWA link, I can share that again. That I will show you where that's at on the website, because I do have a link to that. That is techsafety.org is where that information came from for the VAWA. Okay, thank you, Tara. Is there any other questions before I move on?
How many hours of training for new staff?
The new staff training, that was the 40 hours of, that is all listed. The hours are all listed in the training matrix part on pages 11 through 13. All right, so we will move on with crisis intervention. So with crisis intervention, standard number 9, this is ensuring that your agency is accessible 24/7 to public and to the first responders to provide crisis intervention services. So expectations that you're available 24/7 for all survivors, and that you are keeping data on the number of requests for crisis intervention services that your agency is providing. And standard 10 is ensuring that the survivors in the community have 24/7 access to accompaniment services when they access emergency medical or justice systems. So this is having protocol for medical and criminal or civil justice system emergency response. And if you don't provide it at your program, then the committee is looking to see that you are coordinating with either another program nearby or a community organization in order to provide those emergency responses for medical and or criminal justice systems. And then again, with the data, keeping track of data on the number of requests for accompaniment services and accompaniment services that the agency provided. Standard 11, this is focusing on ensuring that survivors are getting a secure emergency safe shelter who are in imminent danger. So the first measure focuses on establishing and maintaining protocols for addressing shelter requests, including those cannot be met and those that originate outside your service area. And these protocols must include collaborative efforts across agencies to directly connect survivors in imminent danger to appropriate services. So the committee spent a lot of time on this particular measure to ensure that agencies are not just leaving survivors out in the cold, so to speak. So for example, if I'm in Richmond and I get a call from a survivor who's in imminent danger and needs shelter, but the survivor is located in Fredericksburg, it would be my responsibility to connect that survivor with the appropriate program in Fredericksburg so that that survivor could get safe shelter. The second measure with Standard 11 is ensuring that you are safeguarding confidentiality and or personally identifying information during that referral process. And then again, with keeping data on requests for emergency shelter services and emergency shelter services that the agency provided. So again, I'll open it up for questions. Any questions regarding crisis intervention or even administration that might have come up later? You can just put any questions into that chat box. No? Okay. Well, since there's no questions, we will move on to the advocacy section. So standard number 12 is focusing on providing a range of individualized advocacy services which foster survivor healing from the trauma of violence. So the committee is looking for a range of individualized advocacy services that are being provided, such as justice system advocacy, counseling, support groups, case management, referral resources, accompaniment services, and or other holistic services. And then again, maintaining that data, and this is for the request for advocacy services that your agency is providing. Standard 13 is looking at how you're coordinating services within the agency and the community to promote high quality integrated services and support to survivors. So the committee is looking for your agency to have developed and maintained signed agreements such as MOUs, cooperative agreements, partnership agreements with these agencies listed, but this is just a short list. You can be coordinating services with agencies and organizations that are not listed here in order to provide those services to survivors. And standard 14 is looking at addressing the diverse needs of the community served and providing specialized advocacy programs and population-specific interventions. So the committee is looking that you're addressing the diverse needs of your community and that you're providing a range of specialized advocacy services to those identified populations in your service area. So again, that list of identities and populations. And that's the end of the advocacy section. I'll open it up for questions again. Any questions at all, you can put in the chat box.
Say more about what should be tracked regarding the number of requests for crisis intervention services, since shelter and hospital accompaniment is listed elsewhere. Is this just specific types of hotline calls?
That's a crisis intervention.
They didn't indicate which one they were referencing. It just says, can you?
Oh, that was the tracking right now. So the crisis intervention services, that would be example for that data would be the hotline, because yes, then the accompaniment you're tracking in standard 10 and services. So anything would go under the umbrella of crisis intervention, such as hotline services. That's what you'll be tracking for standard number 9. So we have another question, and if that doesn't answer, but we have another question about, do we have to utilize another way of tracking if we put all of our data in VAW data, or is that acceptable? So as far as where you track your data, as long as it's in compliance with VAWA, you can use VAW data, or if you have another client management system that you're using, and it falls in line with VAWA standards, then that's fine. So. Okay, it looks like that's all the questions for that section. So we'll move on to our last section, which is the community engagement. So standard 15, focusing on that your agency is participating in community engagement efforts that promote agency services and effective community responses throughout the agency service area. So this is distributing information about your agency services and accessibility through multiple channels, such as tabling at community events, speaking engagements, social media, so examples such as that listed in the measure. And also that you're tracking data on your community engagement activities that your agency is providing. And standard 16 is focusing on the prevention programming that supports the development of healthy relationships and healthy sexuality. The definitions for healthy relationships and healthy sexuality is in the glossary, as well as the definition for prevention. So the first measure is about creating a prevention plan. So after assessing your agency's resources and community prevention readiness, it's expected that your agency will either focus on building capacity through prevention awareness education efforts, or focus on designing and delivering primary prevention strategies consistent with Virginia's state prevention plan and guidelines for primary prevention. Now, this is still being finalized. It's slated to release in January 2020. So in the meantime, I would suggest to continue referring to the Action Alliance's guidelines for the primary prevention of sexual violence and intimate partner violence until the state prevention plan is released in January. And this is also looking that your agency is collaboratively engaged with others doing similar work in the community. And again, with the data, that you're keeping data on the prevention programs that your agency is providing. And the final standard, 17, that your agency is participating in community engagement initiatives to improve the experiences of survivors and advocate for systemic change. So expectations, you're participating in and or leading sexual and or domestic violence focused community groups like your domestic violence council, sexual assault response teams, interagency councils, etc. Their agency is providing training and education to allied professionals. Their agency is engaging in initiatives and activities that raise awareness, advocate for survivor access to resources, and promote systemic change, such as the National Night Out with local police or Awareness Month activities. And again, with keeping data on community engagement initiatives that your agency is providing. So, are there any other questions with community engagement or really any of the standards, any of the 17 standards? No new questions? Okay. We will move into the resources. So in helping you with your accreditation, getting accredited, as Professional Standards Coordinator, I'm here to provide technical assistance. Whenever you need it, I can do that through email, over the phone, in person, whatever fits your agency best and depending on the technical assistance needed. And if it's something that I am unable to help you with, I will refer you to other agencies such as the Action Alliance, depending on what the technical assistance needs are. So regardless, we'll make sure we will help you out in any way that your agency needs in order to get accredited. And now I will show you the website, which I've mentioned a few times, which has a lot of resources that will help you become accredited, or at least help with some even technical assistance. So this is the main page of the professional standards. And if you are just coming directly to the DCGS homepage in order to get to this page, you would go to this tab, click Victim Services, and then once you're on the Victim Services main page, there will be a sidebar like this, which you could then select Virginia's Sexual and Domestic Violence Program Professional Standards. This is the main page. The manual with all the standards is right here, as well as the self-assessment and the self-assessment summary, which I'll be getting to shortly. And then I can be reached at the SCV standards email. But what I want to turn your attention to is the resources page. So I've put together a lot of resources for you all in helping you become accredited. The VAWA link that I showed you earlier is under direct services. So I'll just take you to this as an example of the resources. I have different links to websites, and there's also downloadable items. So this is just an example of some of the resources. And that link to that tech safety website is right here, the confidentiality VAWA. So I encourage you to check out all these resources, look through it, see what would be helpful for you. And this webinar is being recorded. So if there were some of your staff that were unable to attend, no worries. It will be, I plan on posting the recording sometime tomorrow, and that's going to be located right here under webinars. And we did have the first webinar was last week. So between the first webinar last week and this webinar right now, any questions that have come in, I will be adding them to the FAQ page right here. So I definitely encourage you to explore all parts of the professional standards web pages. Okay. So there is a question?
Yes. Question that came in asked, a couple of questions. What did you say has to be finalized in January 2020 or will be finalized in January 2020?
What is going to be finalized in January 2020 is under standard number 16, the first measure, that Virginia State Prevention Plan and Guidelines for Primary Prevention. That will be published in January of 2020. They're still just tweaking it, going through it. And that will be posted, I was told, on the Community Solutions page. So that will be its home spot. But once that is posted, I plan on updating the manual so that there will be a link to that guide within the standards manual.
Next question is, can we download the webinar? Also, can we get a certificate for the civil rights training?
So the webinar, you will be able to save it because it will be in a MP4 format. So at least on our computers here, Windows Media Player works really well for it. So you should be able to save it then on your computer. And for the civil rights training, there is a certificate, but that is for the grant side of things.
So the DOJ civil rights compliance training, the Department of Justice has indicated they will be generating a certificate that will come up once you have completed that training. However, DOJ has not made that readily available. That is a question that we at DCJS have also had because we have to complete that training also. At this time, however, you can just complete the certificate when you submit your initial solicitations, that certificate, or you can submit a notice to us of the date of that staff completed the training for that compliance. But at this time, no, there is not a certificate that is generated once you complete the civil rights training. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Our next question is, these standards are voluntary, so as of yet, they are not tied to funding.
Correct. So these standards are completely voluntary. It is up to you and your organization if you would like to go through the accreditation. And the second part of that question with the tied to funding, the committee spoke with DCJS and DSS, and there is an agreement that within the first initial 3 years, so as everyone's getting accredited over these next 3 years, accreditation will not be tied to funding for any grants with DCJS and any grants with DSS.
Where are the expectations for each standard?
So that's just the measures underneath each of the standards. What I've been going through those expectations is just the measures and the big bold dots under each standard in bold.
Are prevention standards only applicable to programs receiving prevention funding?
So with the prevention standard, there is that either or. So if you are not able to provide that primary prevention under the second dash of the Creative Prevention Plan big bold dot, there is the option to focus on prevention awareness education efforts.
Is the civil rights training yearly or for all these staff?
With the civil rights training, it is expected that all staff have gone through it. As far as how often, Sierra, you would know more on that.
DCJS, for your grants that you are receiving, we expect the civil rights training is completed with each grant cycle. So at the time that you're submitting your applications for new solicitations, you'll be expected to submit that civil rights training. However, as new staff is onboarded, they are expected to complete that training, whether your agency or organization has already submitted their civil rights training dates or not. So all new staff, as they are on board, they should be completing that training as well. And you can submit notification of the completion of their training to your monitor via an email. Thank you.
Okay, next question.
But after the 3 years to implement these standards, accreditation will be tied to funding.
That is unknown yet. All we have right now from here at DCGS as well as DSS is that the first 3 years, the initial first 3 years of getting everyone accredited, that those first 3 years will not be tied to funding. I cannot currently speak to what will happen after year 3. Both DCGS and DSS will reevaluate where accreditation everyone is in. We'll reevaluate accreditation at that point and then make a decision whether to continue not tying it to funding or tying it to funding. But as of right now, with the initial 3 years, it's not tied to funding.
The staff and volunteers need to have the civil rights training. Any staff that is paid out of federal funds need to complete the civil rights training. That is a requirement of any staff that is paid by federal grant funds. So VOCA, VAWA funds, if any portion of their salary is covered by either one of those federal funding sources, they do have to complete the civil rights training. It is not a requirement of volunteers, however, it is a requirement of grant-funded staff. Thank you. And you can get more information on that from your Statement of Grant Award or SOGA. Thank you.
All right, are there any other questions before we move on? All right, so we will move on with going over the accreditation process. So I'm just going to give you a broad overview of the accreditation process, what's been developed, what's in the works right now. So it is a 3-year accreditation. So the initial 3-year accreditation cycle is 2020, 2021, 2022. So if you're interested in applying so first you'll be assessing your agency's readiness for accreditation by completing the organizational self-assessment. And then if you're interested in applying for accreditation, you would then submit the organizational self-assessment summary. And at that point, you would receive technical assistance to meet all the standards and/or an application to apply for accreditation would be offered to your organization. So those who mark yes, that you're ready for accreditation or on the organizational self-assessment summary will be randomly selected to apply for accreditation. And the committee decided to cap the number of applicants to 20 per year. And if you receive an application to apply, you would submit a one-time fee of $150 at the time of submitting your application. And so after submitting your application, it'll be reviewed by a DCGS consultant. So the committee decided to have an outside person conduct the site visits. So DCGS will be hiring a part-time P14 consultant who will solely be focused on site visits for accreditation. So after reviewing your application, the consultant would schedule a site visit with your program. And with the information from the application and the site visit, the consultant would then provide a formal recommendation to the committee. And so that final review and approval will be done by the Professional Standards Committee regarding accreditation for your program. And there will be an appeals process available if your program is not satisfied with the committee's final decision. So just going over the first steps, which I've kind of already hit on. So you'll want to read the manual, read it thoroughly, send me questions if you have more after today. And then if you're interested in applying for the accreditation, because again, it is a voluntary accreditation process, you would complete the professional standards organizational self-assessment, and this is for your agency's internal use only. So then the only thing you'd be submitting into the professional standards coordinator is the professional standards organizational self-assessment summary. So that just provides a summary of what you fill out on that self-assessment, and that is due by January 31st. And at that point, we'll see where you are at in needing technical assistance and or with offering application for accreditation, which the application piece, you would receive further instructions after February 3rd. So are there any questions regarding that process or the first steps in getting accredited?
How will we verify that we are meeting the standards? For example, under standard number 3, supervisors meet regularly with staff. Would we just say we have biweekly staff meetings and talk with the staff daily?
So yes, we would want the, and when I say we, I mean the committee. The committee would want to see how you're meeting that standard. How you're meeting that measure for standard number 3, and that will either be through explaining it on the application and or at the site visit.
Will training materials, so to clarify, this first step at this point is completely voluntary if we want to apply or not.
So the whole accreditation in general is voluntary, but if you're interested in becoming accredited, the first step is to do the organizational self-assessment.
Will training materials be provided for board members? Who will do the training?
So on page 13 of the manual is the last page of the training matrix, which focuses on content for board training. Now, on the website that I showed you earlier, with the resources section, I do have a whole section for boards, which has a lot of resources that goes with the content that is listed on the training matrix. And the providing of the training, that would be done by your agency. Your agency would be the one providing that training to the board.
If someone applies and is denied, would their agency be able to reapply during the 3-year time frame?
That process, that is still being finalized by the committee. We're right now just focusing on seeing what the interest is with the accreditation, and the committee will be finalizing those details in the spring.
How many times will the DCJS consultant visit the agency? How long will that auditing process take? Then from the time that the DCJS consultant visits the agency to the time that the committee determines whether the agency should be accredited, how long does that take?
So how long the consultant will be at the site visit, that is unknown at this point. It will just be based on how long it would take to go through all of the site visit pieces, which for the site visit, there will be pieces that you'll have to show, such as policies and procedures, and other parts of the site visit will just be the consultant will be asking you questions such as, going back to the person that asked about the supervisor, how are you meeting regularly with your staff? So just those types of things is how the site visit will be going. But then the period of time between the site visit and when the committee would make their final decision, that is still being finalized as well, and we should have more clarification about that in the spring.
When does it become not voluntary tied to grant funding?
So in the beginning portions of the manual, and also as I had stated in the beginning of this webinar, it is in the Virginia Code. The Professional Standards Committee is in the Virginia Code, and it is in the code that the committee develops a voluntary accreditation process. So the accreditation process will always be voluntary, but as far as the funding part, as I've stated previously, the initial 3-year accreditation, that it will not be tied to funding, but after that, that is when DCGS and DSS will have to reevaluate and determine if they want to continue not tying it to funding.
What are the benefits of becoming accredited? Since it is not tied to funding, will it simplify the grant application process?
So it is, accreditation is separate from your grant process, but some of the benefits is just being in the loop about best practices that are going on with sexual and domestic violence services. And related to funding, if you are applying to new funding sources, it will benefit you in that way, because then, you know, the word accreditation will show that your agency is being held to a higher standard compared to an agency that is another agency who is applying for the same grant that is not accredited. And you'll also have all the resources and technical assistance provided by the coordinator and your peers as well to be involved in all of that. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so just to wrap up, as I stated previously, the best way to contact for any questions regarding the standards is scvstandards@dcgs.virginia.gov. This is also, if you are interested in moving forward with the accreditation process, this is also the email address that you will send your completed organizational self-assessment summary. And then here's my direct contact information. I will be available through Wednesday, December 4th. Wednesday, December 4th is my last day here at DCGS. I am going to be going to Old Dominion University as their Assistant Director of the Women's Center. So for those of you in the Tidewater area, I'll be still working with you, just in a different capacity. So then after December 4th, Tiara Smith, who has been on the webinar here with me, she is going to be the interim professional standards coordinator from December 5th on. And so there is her contact information as well. So before I close out, I'll just check in if there's any other questions that you have, throw them in the chat box. Oh, thank you for the shout outs and the congratulations. Thank you so much. Okay, so county attorney explained that since we are a government agency, if we are not accredited, the protections of VAWA would not be in place for how our records are handled.
Government agencies tend to have, they fall into the exceptions. I don't remember when we talked about that. They have exceptions.
Right. So, yeah, the government agencies will have some of those, some exceptions, such as those related to VAWA. I will have to get back to you on that, because if you're not, I will get back to you on that because one of our committee members is a government agency, so is with a government agency, so I can look more into that and get back to you. Oh, okay, that was still that question. All right. Well, thank you all for hanging in here with me this afternoon and going through the webinar. If you happen to celebrate Thanksgiving, I hope you have a really great Thanksgiving with your family and friends. And I hope you have a great rest of your Thursday. Thank you.